Mia ignored the shattered plates and the angry whispers of the elite patrons at Listel. She dropped to her knees on the marble floor beside the screaming 7-year-old boy. While the manager moved to kick the family out, Mia gently tapped a rhythmic pattern on the tile. To the shock of the billionaire father, the boy instantly silenced his cries and reached for the hand of the waitress, finding peace in her patience when the rest of the world offered only judgment. Before we start, your support means everything to us. Like, comment, subscribe, and let us know where you are watching from. Enjoy the story. The cacophony of Listel was a physical weight pressing against the spine of 32-year-old Mia Moretti as she weaved through the maze of white linen tables with a heavy tray of osso buco. This was supposed to be the finest Italian dining experience in Manhattan, but to Mia it felt like a gladiatorial arena where the wealthy came to feast on the dignity of the service staff. Her feet ached in her cheap black shoes, a stark contrast to the Italian leather soles resting on the footrails of the mahogany bar. More wine and be quick about it. A man in a charcoal suit barked without looking up from his phone, snapping his fingers as if summoning a stray dog. Mia swallowed the sharp retort that rose in her throat and simply nodded, murmuring, "Of course, sir, right away," in a voice she had trained to be devoid of texture or spirit. 3 years ago, she would have been the one sitting at that table discussing pediatric neurology and grant proposals, but that life felt like a fever dream now. She paused at the service station to help a trembling busboy steady a towering stack of dirty plates, her hands moving with the steady precision of a surgeon. As she wiped a smudge of marinara sauce from her apron, her fingers brushed against the cold metal of a silver ring suspended on a chain beneath her uniform. It was her only relic, a simple band engraved with the medical caduceus given to her the day she became Dr. Moretti. Moretti, stop dreaming and start moving. The floor manager, Mr. Rossi, hissed into her ear, his breath smelling of stale espresso. Table 7 is waiting. Mia nodded, keeping her head down, terrified of losing the meager income that kept a roof over her head. Just as she turned to the kitchen, the heavy oak doors at the front of the restaurant swung open with a dramatic thud, silencing the host stand. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from casual indulgence to electrified awareness. Dominic Thorne had arrived. The real estate mogul looked like a man carved from granite, and stress his dark suit tailored to perfection, but straining across shoulders that carried the weight of an empire. Hanging on his arm was Camilla, a woman who shone with the hard, brittle brilliance of a diamond, checking her reflection in the glass of the door before glancing disdainfully at the crowded room. But Mia's eyes were drawn immediately to the third member of the party. Clinging to Dominic's hand was a 7-year-old boy named Leo, whose small face was pale with terror. While the rest of the staff scrambled to accommodate the VIPs, Mia froze. She watched Leo shrink away from the assault of the crystal chandelier's glare, his hands flying up to cover his ears. She saw the telltale rocking motion of his torso, the way his eyes darted frantically without locking onto anything, and the terrified rigidity of his posture. "Dominic, why must we bring him everywhere?" Camilla complained loudly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a serrated knife. "He is going to ruin my dress with those sticky hands." Dominic ignored her, kneeling down to his son's level, ignoring the whispers of the elite patrons around them. "It is okay, Leo," he murmured, his voice deep and desperate, trying to create a shield with his broad back. "Just breathe, buddy." But Mia knew he was failing. She recognized the signs of sensory overload cascading through the boy's nervous system. The manager rushed forward with a sycophantic smile to seat them at a center table, the worst possible location for the child. But Mia could only watch from the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs as the inevitable disaster began to unfold. The air at the center table grew thick with tension as the ambient volume of the restaurant climbed steadily higher, acting like a pressure cooker for the 7-year-old boy trapped in its center. For Leo, the clatter of porcelain and the roar of conversation were not just background noise, they were a physical assault, a barrage of chaotic frequencies that scrambled his ability to process the world around him. He began to rock back and forth in his velvet chair, a low, guttural hum escaping his throat as he tried to drown out the external stimuli with a rhythm he could control. The elite patrons of L'Estelle paused over their risotto and wine-casting judgmental side glances at the disruption, their whispers curling through the air like toxic smoke. Camilla noticed the attention immediately, and her spine stiffened with indignation, not for the child suffering beside her, but for the damage being done to her social standing. "Dominic, he is doing it again," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom as she stabbed at her salad. "Make him stop before he humiliates us completely. People are staring, Dominic." Dominic looked helpless, his large hands hovering near his son, unsure of whether to touch him and risk escalating the panic or to let him ride out. "The storm. Leo, buddy, listen to my voice," Dominic pleaded softly, but his own anxiety was bleeding into his tone, making it impossible for the boy to find an anchor. The floor manager, Mr. Rossi, materialized at the edge of the table like a vulture sensing weakness, his smile tight and failing to reach his cold eyes. "Mr. Thorne, perhaps the boy would be more comfortable outside," Mr. Rossi suggested, his tone oily with faux concern that barely masked his desire to eject the problem. "We have other guests complaining about the noise, and this is a place of refinement." Dominic opened his mouth to argue, to defend his son's right to exist in public space, but before he could speak, the pressure inside Leo reached a breaking point. The boy jerked his arm in a spasm of overwhelming frustration, and his hand collided with a crystal goblet. The sound of shattering glass tore through the restaurant, silencing the room instantly, as water and shards cascaded across the white tablecloth and onto the marble floor. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, broken only by Camilla's shriek of outrage. "You clumsy little brat," she shouted, abandoning all pretense of poise as she grabbed Leo's arm, roughly, her manicured nails digging into his soft skin. "Look what you have done. You are impossible to take anywhere." Leo let out a high-pitched wail of pure terror, shrinking away from her touch, but trapped by her grip. Dominic froze, paralyzed by the sudden escalation and the weight of 100 staring eyes, but Mia Moretti did not freeze. From her station in the shadows, she saw not a misbehaving child, but a neurological system in critical distress. The oath she had taken as a doctor years ago to do no harm, and to help those in need, roared to life in her chest, drowning out the fear of losing her job. She dropped her heavy tray on the service counter with a clatter that Mr. Rossi turned to reprimand, but she was already moving. She did not walk like a waitress, she moved with the urgent authority of a first responder, crossing the dining room floor in 3 long strides. Ignoring Mr. Rossi's shout of "Moretti, get back to your station," she reached the disaster zone and did the unthinkable. She did not reach for a towel to clean the mess, nor did she apologize to the angry woman. Instead, Mia dropped to her knees directly into the puddle of water and broken glass, ruining her uniform instantly. By placing herself on the floor, she physically lowered the threat level, creating a human barrier between the terrified boy and the gawking crowd. She positioned herself so that Leo had to look down at her, forcing his eyes away from the glaring lights and the angry faces, giving him a single calm focal point in a world that had turned into chaos. Mia ignored the cold water soaking into her knees and focused entirely on the terrified boy. She did not try to touch him or shush him like everyone else had tried. Instead, she began a specific, rhythmic pattern on the marble tile with her knuckles. 1, 2, pause, 1. It was a neurological grounding beat she had used 1,000 times in her clinic. "It is okay, Leo, look at the beat," she whispered, her voice pitching into a melodic low frequency that cut straight through the sensory static. Dominic Thorne watched in stunned silence as the humble waitress effectively neutralized the panic his billions could not fix. She slowly extended her hand palm up, not to grab, but to offer space. With her other hand, she made the precise movements of American Sign Language, signaling safe and then quiet. It was not the clumsy signing of an amateur, but the fluid communication of a medical expert. "Just us, Leo, just the beat," she murmured, keeping her eyes soft and averted to reduce the pressure on him. Slowly, miraculously, Leo's screaming subsided into jagged breaths, his tear-filled eyes locked onto her tapping fingers. Then he did the impossible. He mimicked the rhythm on his own thigh. 1, 2. Pause. 1. The suffocating tension in the restaurant evaporated, leaving only a profound quiet. Camilla rolled her eyes. "Finally the servant does something useful," she muttered, checking her phone. But Dominic did not hear her. He felt a wave of relief so physical it nearly buckled his knees. He was staring at the top of the waitress's head, realizing she had just built a bridge to his son in 30 seconds when he had spent 7 years trying to find a boat. The connection was electric, undeniable, and entirely out of place for a woman wearing a stained apron. The rhythmic tapping on the wet floor tiles slowed to a halt as Leo finally synchronized his breathing with the calm, steady presence of the woman kneeling in the water before him. In the heavy silence following the storm, the 7-year-old boy did something that made the air leave Dominic Thorne's lungs in a sudden rush. Leo reached out his small, trembling hand and wrapped his fingers tightly around Mia's thumb, anchoring himself to her strength. Dominic watched through a blur of unshed tears as his son, who usually flinched at the touch of his own grandmother, sought comfort from a stranger in a marinara-stained apron. It was a quiet miracle witnessed only by the father who had spent years praying for exactly this kind of connection. The spell was rudely broken by the harsh squeak of rubber soles as Mr. Rossi arrived armed with a mop and a face purple with rage, ready to berate his employee for making a scene. "Moretti, get up this instant and clean this mess," the manager hissed, reaching out to grab Mia's shoulder. "Do not touch her." Dominic's voice rang out low and dangerous, stopping Mr. Rossi dead in his tracks. The billionaire was not looking at the manager, he was looking at the waitress with an intensity that could have melted steel. Mia ignored the manager completely, turning her attention back to the boy one last time. "You did excellent work regulating your sensory input, Leo," she whispered, using the clinical terminology of a specialist rather than the baby talk of a layperson. "That was very brave." She slowly withdrew her hand and stood up, her knees cracking slightly from the hard floor. In the blink of an eye, the authoritative healer vanished, and the invisible servant returned as she smoothed her apron and lowered her head. "I will bring a fresh cloth for the table, sir," she murmured, stepping back. Dominic fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking as he pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, desperate to offer something to the woman who had saved his son. "Please," he stammered, holding the cash out to her. "Take this, it is the least I can do." Mia looked at the money and then up at Dominic's eyes, her expression softening with a dignity that money could not buy. She gently pushed his hand away. "Put that away, Mr. Thorne," she said softly but firmly. "Kindness does not require payment, and your son is not a burden to be managed. He is just a boy trying to cope." She turned on her heel to leave before he could argue, and as she spun, the silver chain around her neck swung, free from her collar. For a split second, the light from the chandelier caught the object dangling there. It was not a locket or a cross. It was a heavy silver ring engraved with the twin snakes of the caduceus, the universal symbol of medicine. Dominic froze as the image burned into his mind, realizing with a jolt that this woman was far more than she truly appeared to be. The remainder of the evening at Listel dissolved into a suffocating pageant of forced smiles and simmering resentment as Camilla complained about the service and the lingering embarrassment of the shattered glass. By the time the valet brought the sleek black Maybach around to the curb, the sun had dipped below the skyline, leaving Manhattan bathed in a twilight that felt cold and indifferent. Dominic Thorne helped his fiancée into the car, listening to the sharp click of her heels on the pavement, a sound that echoed the hollow feeling growing in his chest. "That was absolutely mortifying, Dominic," Camilla muttered the moment the heavy door sealed them inside the soundproof cabin, her voice sharp and grating against his tired mind. "I cannot believe you let that servant speak to us like that." She was condescending and frankly unhygienic, kneeling in dirty water like an animal. Dominic did not answer her. Instead, he turned his gaze to the seat beside him where 7-year-old Leo had finally succumbed to exhaustion. The boy was curled into a tight ball, his breathing steady and deep, a stark contrast to the hyperventilating panic that had gripped him only an hour ago. Dominic's eyes traced the curve of his son's face, softening with a love that was fierce and terrifying. In Leo's small hand clutched tight against his chest was a small white object. It was a paper napkin folded with intricate precision into the shape of a crane. The waitress Mia must have slipped it to him in those final moments, a silent token of their bond. Dominic felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the fragile paper bird. He realized with a jolt of clarity that the best pediatric therapists money could buy, charging $500 an hour, had never once elicited a calm like this from his son. They came with clipboards and cold clinical detachment, viewing Leo as a puzzle to be solved rather than a boy to be understood. Yet a waitress with marinara sauce on her apron had achieved peace in 5 minutes, using nothing but a rhythmic tap and genuine empathy. "Are you even listening to me, Dominic?" Camilla snapped, tapping on her phone screen with a manicured fingernail. "I am booking a spa day tomorrow. To recover from this stress, I simply cannot deal with his outbursts." Dominic looked at her, then back to the crane. The contrast between the woman who demanded to be served and the woman who served on her knees was blinding. He pulled his phone from his pocket, but not to check emails. He opened a secure messaging app and typed a command to his head of security. "Find out everything about a waitress named Mia at Listel immediately." He hit send, his thumb hovering over the screen as he recalled the silver ring swinging from her neck. The caduceus. The medical sign. "Who are you really, Mia?" he whispered to himself as the car glided through the dark night, carrying him away from the only warmth he had felt in years. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling glass of Dominic Thorne's midtown office, casting long, sharp shadows across the expansive mahogany desk that served as his command center. He had barely slept the previous night as the image of the waitress kneeling on the wet floor looped in his mind like a film reel he could not pause. When the heavy double doors opened, admitting his head of security, Arthur, the air in the room shifted instantly from stagnant contemplation to sharp anticipation. "You worked fast, Arthur," Dominic noted, accepting the thick manila envelope the older man extended towards him. "You are going to want to sit down for this, boss," Arthur replied, his voice grim and low. "It is not what we expected at all." Dominic slid the dossier open, and the first thing that greeted him was a photograph. It was Mia, but not the exhausted shadow he had met last night at the restaurant. This woman was radiant, wearing a crisp white coat, and standing in front of a hospital wing, her smile bright enough to light up the room. Underneath the photo, the name was printed in bold block letters that demanded respect: Dr. Mia Moretti. Dominic felt the blood drain from his face as he traced the title with his thumb. "She is a doctor," he whispered, the jagged pieces of the puzzle slamming into place with the force of a physical blow. The precise sign language, the neurological grounding tapping the calm authority in a crisis, it all made perfect sense now. He turned the page hungry for the rest of the story, but what he found turned his wonder into a cold, hard fury. The file detailed a spectacular fall from grace that had occurred exactly 3 years ago. Mia had been a rising star in pediatric neurology, specializing in sensory processing disorders until a clinical trial went wrong. She had been accused of falsifying data and gross negligence, resulting in the permanent revocation of her medical license and the destruction of her reputation. But, as Dominic read the transcripts of the disciplinary hearing, a specific name caught his eye: Dr. Marco Cellini, her fiancé and lead research partner. Marco had provided the damning testimony that sealed her fate, and coincidentally, he had immediately taken over her grant funding and her prestigious position at the hospital. It was a setup, Dominic realized aloud, his voice vibrating with a protective anger he had not felt in years. He stole her life. He looked at the details of the hearing, seeing how Mia had been silenced, how her defense had been buried under Marco's lies, and the hospital's desire to avoid a scandal. She had lost everything: her career, her credibility, her future. And yet she had knelt on a dirty floor to save his son with a kindness that the world had tried to beat out of her. Dominic stood up, walking to the window to look out at the indifferent city. "Get the car, Arthur," Dominic commanded, his grey eyes turning to steel. "We are going to lunch." The lunch rush at Listel had faded into the drowsy silence of mid-afternoon, leaving the dining room empty save for the distant clinking of silverware and the low hum of the refrigerator units. Mia Moretti leaned against the service station, rubbing the ache in her lower back, enjoying the brief respite before the dinner chaos began. She was startled when the host, Mr. Rossi, hurried over his face, pale and sweating. "Table 4 needs service immediately," he whispered urgently, his eyes wide with anxiety. "He asked for you specifically. Do not mess this up, Moretti." Mia frowned, wiping her damp hands on her stained apron and stepping out onto the floor. Her heart skipped a violent beat when she saw who was sitting alone at the secluded corner table. It was Dominic Thorne, but he looked different today. Gone was the panicked father shielding his son, and gone was the imperious billionaire. He sat with a quiet stillness, his grey eyes tracking her approach with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He had not ordered food, only a glass of sparkling water sat untouched before him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thorne," Mia said, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her stomach. "Can I get you anything to eat?" Dominic shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. "I am not here for the food, Mia," he said softly, using her first name with a familiarity that felt dangerous. "I am here because I have a question about last night." Mia gripped her order pad tighter, using it as a flimsy shield. "I am glad I could help your son, sir. I hope he is feeling better today." "He slept through the night for the first time in months," Dominic replied, "because of what you did." That tapping rhythm on the floor, where did you learn that? Mia felt the trap closing around her, but she tried to sidestep it. "I just picked it up somewhere, just a soothing trick I use with kids." Dominic leaned forward, resting his elbows on the white tablecloth, his expression unyielding. "It is called the rhythmic entrainment technique," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "It is a specialized neurological method used to synchronize brainwave frequencies in patients with sensory processing disorders. It is not something a waitress picks up at a diner." Mia froze her breath, catching in her throat. She looked for an exit, but there was nowhere to run. Dominic reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the thick dossier, placing it gently on the table between them. "I know who you are," he whispered. "I know about the grants. I know about the research, and I know about the injustice you suffered." He looked up, meeting her terrified eyes. "Hello, Dr. Moretti." The title hung in the air between them, a ghost she had spent 3 years trying to bury. Mia felt the room spin. Please, she stammered, backing away. If my manager hears you, I will lose this job. It is all I have. You should have so much more, Dominic said fiercely. Please sit down, doctor. We need to talk. Mia looked at the empty velvet chair opposite the billionaire, and then back at the manager station where Mr. Rossi was furiously arguing with a wine vendor. She made a decision that felt terrifyingly like stepping off a cliff. She sat down. The dossier lay between them like a grenade, destroying the life she used to know. You have to understand, Mr. Thorne. She began, her voice trembling. I did not lose my license because I was incompetent. I lost it because I made the fatal mistake of trusting the wrong person. Dominic leaned in closer, his broad shoulders forming a protective wall. Tell me, he urged, his voice low. I want to hear your truth. Mia took a shaky breath, and the dam she had built over 3 agonizing years finally broke. She told him about Dr. Marco Cellini. We were partners in every sense. She explained, her eyes fixed on the condensation sliding down his water glass. We spent 4 years developing a non-invasive therapy for sensory processing disorders, just like what you saw with Leo. It was my life's work. But when the federal grant renewal came up, Marco realized the preliminary data was not statistically significant enough. I wanted to wait. Marco wanted the money immediately. He falsified the patient charts using my encrypted login credentials while I was away attending a neurology conference in Chicago. When the review board found the discrepancies, he turned on me. He testified that I had ordered him to do it, that I was desperate for the funding. Dominic's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped visibly in his cheek. And they believed him, he stated flatly. He was charming, and I was the ambitious woman who flew too close to the sun. Mia replied with a smile that looked more like a wound. He kept the grant money. He kept the research data. I was stripped of my license, fined into bankruptcy, and blacklisted. Now he runs the department using my protocols while I serve pasta to people who do not even see me. The silence that followed was heavy, but filled with the weight of her truth finally being spoken aloud. Dominic reached across the table, stopping short of taking her hand. I believe you, he said, and the words hit her with the force of a physical blow. I believe you, Mia. She stared at him, shocked. Why? She asked. The medical board did not believe me. Why would you? Dominic's gray eyes were like storm clouds, but the lightning in them was directed at her enemies. Because I saw what you did last night, he said, his voice rough. A person who falsifies data for money does not kneel in dirty water to comfort a screaming child for free. Your integrity is not written on a paper license, it is written in your actions. He sat back, looking at her as an equal. You are the diamond in the rough, Dr. Moretti, he murmured. And I intend to make sure the world sees you shine again. Dominic closed the heavy manila dossier with a sharp, decisive snap that echoed like a gavel strike in the quiet restaurant, effectively ending the chapter of her past and opening the door to a terrifying new future. He did not pull away from the heavy silence that settled between them. Instead, he leaned into it, his steel gray eyes, locking onto Mia with a business intensity that made her breath hitch in her throat. I am not sitting here offering you sympathy, Mia. I am offering you a job, he stated, his voice devoid of pity, but full of unshakable purpose. Mia blinked, confused, expecting a handout, but Dominic shook his head, dismissing her assumption before she could even speak. I need someone who understands Leo's complex neurological landscape, and you are the only person on this earth who has ever breached his walls. I want to hire you as his private therapeutic companion starting today. The words hung in the air, shimmering with impossibility. I will pay you triple your current annual salary, effective immediately. Mia felt the room tilt on its axis. 3 times her salary meant freedom, it meant dignity, it meant finally paying off the crushing legal debts that were drowning her. but fear, cold and familiar, coiled tightly in her gut. "Mr. Thorne, I cannot," she whispered, gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. "I am unlicensed. If the medical board finds out I am practicing therapy without credentials, I could face jail time, and your fiancée, she will never allow a disgraced doctor in her home." Dominic's expression did not waver for a second. He reached across the table, and for the first time he took her hand, his grip warm and calloused, a physical anchor in her storm. "In my house, I make the rules, not the medical board," he said fiercely, his voice a low rumble that vibrated deep in her chest. "I am not hiring a license on a piece of paper. I am hiring the woman who knows how to fold a paper crane to save a terrified boy. As for Camilla, she does not dictate the care of my son, I do." Mia looked down at their joined hands, then at the marinara stain on her apron, the uniform that marked her as invisible. She looked around the restaurant at Mr. Rossi, scolding a busboy at the empty tables that represented a life of servitude. Then she looked back at Dominic and saw something she had not seen in 3 years: belief. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of possibility. "Okay," she breathed, her voice gaining strength. "Okay, I will do it." She stood up, her legs shaking but holding her weight. She untied the apron strings, letting the fabric fall to the floor in a heap. "Where are you going?" Dominic asked, standing with her. Mia turned toward the manager's station, her head held high. "I have to resign, Mr. Thorne," she said. "My shift is over." The private elevator doors slid open with a soft chime to reveal a penthouse that felt more like a museum of glass and cold marble than a home for a child. But Mia Moretti stepped into the foyer, clutching her worn bag of sensory tools, feeling the intimidation of the wealth, but pushing it aside when she spotted 7-year-old Leo peeking out from behind a massive velvet sofa. Dominic Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his posture rigid with anxiety, as he watched the woman he had plucked from a restaurant floor attempt to reach his son in this fortress of wealth. Mia did not waste time with pleasantries. She simply slipped off her shoes to signal she was not a threat and sank onto the plush Persian rug. "Hello, Leo," she signed, her hands moving with the grace of a dancer. "I brought the beat with me." She began a soft, rhythmic tapping on her own knees, and slowly, cautiously, the boy crept out from his hiding spot. For the next hour, the atmosphere in the room shifted from sterile to sacred as Mia dimmed the harsh, recessed lighting and built a sensory fortress using throw pillows and weighted blankets she had brought from her own small apartment. Dominic leaned against the doorframe, breathless, as he watched Mia guide his son through a series of communication exercises using textured cards and sign language. Then it happened. A sound so foreign it startled the silence. Leo laughed. It was a rusty, quiet sound, but it was undeniably joy. Dominic felt tears prick his eyes, but the miracle was shattered instantly by the sharp, aggressive click of stilettos on the marble entry. Camilla swept into the room, laden with designer shopping bags, her face twisting into a mask of sheer revulsion when she saw Mia sitting on the floor in her simple slacks and blouse. "What in God's name is the help doing lounging in the main living area?" Camilla screeched, dropping her bags with a crash that made Leo flinch violently and cover his ears. "And why is she not wearing a uniform, Dominic? This is unacceptable." Mia scrambled to stand up, her old instincts to apologize, rising to the surface, but Dominic moved with the speed of a striking cobra crossing the room to place himself physically between his fiancée and the therapist. "Lower your voice, Camilla, immediately," Dominic commanded, his tone dropping to a sub-zero temperature that froze the air in the room. "This is Dr. Moretti, and she is here as a specialist for my son, not a maid." Camilla scoffed, pointing a manicured finger at Mia like a weapon. "She is a waitress, Dominic. I saw her serving osso buco yesterday. You cannot dress up a servant and call her a doctor. It is pathetic and embarrassing." Dominic took a step closer to her, his gray eyes blazing with a protective aso. Fury. "She is a guest in this home," he stated, his voice vibrating with raw power that made Camilla take a step back. "And unlike you, she has managed to make my son smile in 1 hour, which is more than you have achieved in 2 years. The silence that slammed into the room was deafening as Camilla recoiled as if she had been slapped while Leo crept forward to grip Mia's hand. "If you cannot respect the people helping my son," Dominic finished, "then you are the one who does not belong here." Over the course of the next 3 weeks, the cold marble fortress of the penthouse underwent a subtle but profound thawing as the presence of Mia Moretti seeped into its very foundations. Dominic Thorne, known throughout Manhattan as the Iron CEO who never left his office before midnight, began to shock his executive board by abruptly ending meetings at 5 in the afternoon. He told his assistants it was to oversee his son's therapy, but as the private elevator carried him upward, his heart hammered with a shameful anticipation, not just to see Leo, but to see her. One rainy Tuesday evening, after a breakthrough session where Leo had successfully identified 3 emotions using flashcards, the atmosphere shifted from clinical to intimate. The penthouse was quiet, save for the drumming of rain against the glass, and Leo was fast asleep, clutching his paper crane. Dominic found Mia in the kitchen brewing herbal tea, her hair loose around her shoulders for the first time, stripping away the severity of her professional persona. "You look tired, doctor," he said softly, leaning against the granite island, watching the way the soft under-cabinet lighting cast shadows on her cheekbones. "It is a good tired," Mia replied, blowing on the steam rising from her mug, "the kind that comes from building something rather than just surviving." They moved to the living room, sitting not on the stiff designer furniture, but on the rug near the window, watching the city lights blur in the rain. For the next 2 hours, they did not speak of sensory processing or schedules. Instead, they spoke of Italian Renaissance art and the complex neurology of memory, debating the intersection of science and soul with a fervor that made Dominic feel more alive than any billion-dollar merger ever had. He realized with a jolt that he had been lonely in his own home for years, surrounded by people but utterly isolated until this disgraced doctor walked in and turned the lights on. "You are brilliant, Mia," he murmured, his voice rough with admiration. "It is a crime that you are not running a department." Mia looked down her eyelashes, casting long shadows. "I was broken, Dominic," she whispered. "I did not think I had anything left to offer." Dominic reached out his hand, hovering near hers on the rug, the air between them crackling with an electricity that terrified and thrilled him. "You are not broken," he told her fiercely. "You were just in the wrong environment, and I promise you I am going to build you a new one." At that moment his phone buzzed on the coffee table, a text from Camilla. Complaining about a broken nail, Dominic glanced at the screen and then back at the woman who had saved his son and healed his home. The choice was becoming agonizingly clear. He was a man starving for substance who had been trying to survive on a diet of sugar, and now that he had tasted the real thing, he knew he could never go back. The turning point arrived on a crisp Thursday morning when Dominic Thorne placed a heavy cream envelope on the marble kitchen island, his expression uncharacteristically nervous as he watched Mia prepare Leo's sensory schedule. "The Hope Foundation Charity Gala is this Saturday," he announced, his voice casual but his eyes intense. "It is the most important social event of the season for autism advocacy, and I want you to come with us." Mia froze her pen, hovering over the paper, as the request hung in the air like a pendulum swinging between professional duty and personal danger. "Mr. Thorne, surely Camilla will be accompanying you," she countered, knowing the rigid protocols of his high society world. "Camilla hates these events, and more importantly, Leo needs support, not a photo opportunity," Dominic replied firmly. "If you are there, he might actually enjoy himself instead of just surviving it," The implications were staggering because stepping into the flashbulbs of the paparazzi with him would signal a shift that Camilla would never tolerate. Indeed, when the fiancé discovered the arrangement an hour later, the explosion shook the walls of the penthouse. "You are taking the help to the gala," Camilla screamed, her face contorted with a jealousy that had curdled into pure malice. "You are humiliating me, Dominic, and I will not stand for it." But Dominic simply walked past her, his decision made of iron, leaving her seething in the foyer. Left alone, and realizing her position as the future, Mrs. Thorne was slipping through her manicured fingers. Camilla made a fatal calculation. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had dug up from old court records. "Dr. Cellini," she purred when the line connected, her voice dripping with venomous intent. "I believe we have a mutual problem named Mia Moretti, and I would like to discuss how to destroy her permanently." While Camilla plotted in the penthouse, Dominic sat in a soundproof conference room across the city, flanked by 3 forensic accountants and his fiercest litigator. On the screen before them was a complex web of financial transfers and time-stamped server logs from 3 years ago. "It is exactly as she said, Mr. Thorne," the lead investigator confirmed, pointing to a highlighted column. The login credentials used to falsify the data were accessed from a static IP address in Dr. Cellini's home office, while Dr. Moretti was verifiably at a conference in Chicago. Dominic stared at the evidence, his jaw clenching as the full scope of the betrayal crystallized before him. He did not just frame her, Dominic growled, his voice low and dangerous. He systematically erased her existence to fund his own ambition. The investigator nodded grimly. "We have enough to bury him, sir, but if we move now, he might destroy the original data backups." "Wait until Saturday," Dominic commanded, his eyes cold. "Let him feel safe one last time, because at the gala I am going to tear his life apart in front of the entire city." The heavy velvet curtains of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel parted to reveal a world that Mia Moretti had not dared to enter for 3 long years, but tonight she did not look like an exile. The midnight blue silk gown that Dominic Thorne had selected for her draped over her frame with liquid elegance, its modest cut highlighting the grace she had hidden beneath a waitress uniform for too long. She stepped onto the red carpet, not behind the billionaire, but beside him, and between them walked 7-year-old Leo, holding their hands with a calmness that baffled the paparazzi lining the ropes. For the first time in the history of the Thorne Empire, the flashes of the cameras did not send the boy into a screaming meltdown, because Mia was squeezing his hand in the specific 3-tap rhythm that signaled safety. "You are doing perfectly, Leo," she whispered, her smile radiant and genuine. "Just focus on the beat." Dominic looked down at the two of them, his chest swelling with a pride that had nothing to do with stock prices, and everything to do with the family unit they had formed. But the illusion of peace was shattered the moment they reached the top of the grand staircase, where Camilla stood, waiting like a viper coiled to strike. She was dressed in aggressive crimson, her eyes burning with a manic triumph, having spent the last 48 hours weaponizing the information Marco Cellini had fed her. She stepped directly into their path, signaling the press pool to turn their microphones toward her. "Stop right there, Dominic," Camilla screamed, her voice shrill and theatrical, designed to carry over the din of the crowd. "I will not let you take that woman inside." Dominic tried to steer them around her, his expression hardening into stone, but Camilla lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at Mia's face. "Do you all know who this is?" she shouted to the hungry reporters. "This is not a therapist, this is Mia Moretti, the disgraced doctor who was stripped of her license for gross negligence and malpractice." The air left the room as a collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. "My fiancé is endangering his autistic son by employing a fraud who falsified medical data." Camilla continued, her smile cruel and victorious. "She is a danger to children." The reaction was instantaneous and brutal, as a wall of blinding white flashes erupted in Mia's face. disorienting her like a physical assault. The aggressive shouting of the reporters asking if the allegations were true merged into a deafening roar that transported her back to the worst day of her life in the courtroom. Mia trembled violently, her vision blurring as the suffocating weight of the shame she had outrun for 3 years finally caught her under the unforgiving glare of the public eye, while Camilla stood gloating, sure that she had just destroyed her rival for good. Mia felt the marble floor tilt beneath her feet as the impulse to flee screamed through her nervous system, urging her to run from the blinding lights and the judgment of the world. But she could not move because a hand had clamped around hers with the force of an iron shackle, anchoring her to the spot. It was not a grip of anger, but one of absolute solidarity. Dominic Thorne did not step away from the disgraced doctor to save his own reputation. As Camilla had calculated, instead, he stepped physically in front of her, using his broad shoulders to shield her face from the assault of the camera. Flashes. He looked at his fiancée with a disappointment so profound it chilled the air between them. Then he snatched a microphone from the hands of a stunned reporter near the velvet ropes. The screech of audio feedback silenced the chaotic shouting of the press pool instantly. "You are absolutely right, Camilla." Dominic's voice boomed across the grand entrance, echoing off the stone walls. "There is indeed a massive fraud present at this gala tonight, but it is not the woman holding my son's hand." He raised his free hand and snapped his fingers, a prearranged signal to Arthur and the security team stationed in the control booth. Immediately, the massive LED screens above the hotel entrance, which had been displaying the logos of corporate sponsors, flickered and changed. The crowd gasped in unison as the screens filled with high-resolution images of bank transfers and complex server logs. "What you are looking at is the digital footprint of a crime," Dominic declared, his voice ringing with the authority of a judge delivering a verdict. "These documents prove that the research data Dr. Moretti was accused of falsifying 3 years ago was actually accessed and altered from a static IP address registered to Dr. Marco Cellini." A murmur of shock rippled through the elite crowd as the name of the prominent doctor was spoken. The timestamps clearly show that while Dr. Moretti was attending a conference in Chicago, her partner was in New York destroying her career to steal her federal grant funding. Dominic turned to face the cameras directly, his gray eyes blazing with a protective fury that captivated every lens. "Mia Moretti is not a danger to children. She is the victim of a calculated destruction, and despite losing everything, she is the only person who possessed the skill and the heart to reach my son when the entire medical establishment failed him." He looked down at Mia, who was staring up at him with tears streaming down her face, realizing that he was not just defending her, he was rewriting her history in real time. "The real danger to this community," Dominic finished, his voice dropping to a deadly calm, "is the man who stole her life to advance his own, and the people who are willing to believe a lie simply because it is convenient." Camilla's triumphant smile faltered and then shattered completely as the journalists she had summoned turned their hungry eyes away from Mia and toward the undeniable truth glowing on the screens above. Camilla stood amidst the ruin of her social standing, vibrating with the desperate manic energy of a cornered animal, realizing that the narrative she had carefully constructed was crumbling under the weight of hard data. Instead of accepting the dignified defeat offered by silence, she chose to double down, her face twisting into a grotesque mask of rage that stripped away her beauty to reveal the ugliness beneath. "That is all fake," she screamed, her voice cracking as she stomped her foot on the red carpet like a petulant child. "Dominic has fabricated those documents to protect his mistress. He is brainwashed, and she is manipulating that retard boy to get to his money." The slur hung in the air like a cloud of poison gas, drawing a collective gasp of horror from the onlookers, but before Dominic could verbally eviscerate her for the insult, something extraordinary happened. 7-year-old Leo released his father's hand. The boy who had spent his entire life shrinking away from confrontation, seeking the shadows to hide from the noise, stepped forward into the center of the spotlight. He did not rock, he did not cover his ears, and he did not scream. He looked directly at the woman who had tormented him for 2 years with her disdain and intolerance. The silence that fell over the Grand Metropolitan Hotel was absolute, as hundreds of people held their breath watching the child find his courage. Leo opened his mouth, his throat working hard to form the sounds he had hoarded for so long. "Stop," he said. The word was not loud, but it was clear, striking the air with the force of a hammer shattering glass. "You are mean." He then turned his back on her, dismissing her existence completely, and looked up at Mia. With deliberate grace, he raised his hands and made the sign she had taught him on the floor of the restaurant. He crossed his arms over his chest, tapping his shoulders. Safe. Then he wrapped his small arms around Mia's waist, pressing his face into the silk of her gown in a fierce, protective hug. The image was undeniable proof that destroyed Camilla's accusations instantly. A child does not hug a monster, a child hugs their savior. The cameras flashed, capturing not a scandal but a miracle. The crowd erupted not in applause, but in a murmur of profound reverence for the bond they were witnessing. Realizing she had become the villain in her own story, and that the society she worshipped was looking at her with pure disgust, Camilla let out a choked sob of humiliation. She turned and fled down the stairs, tripping on her crimson dress, in her haste to escape the judgment she had brought upon herself, leaving behind only the echo of her cruelty and the triumph of a boy who had finally found his voice. The heavy silence that settled over the Grand Metropolitan Hotel following Camilla's chaotic exit was not empty, but charged with the static electricity of judgment shifting its target. While the crowd was still processing the emotional aftershocks of a 7-year-old boy's first spoken words in years, Dominic Thorne turned his predatory gaze toward the shadows near the coat check, where a figure in a tuxedo was attempting to slip unnoticed toward the revolving doors. Dr. Cellini Dominic's voice cracked through the high-ceilinged lobby like a whip, stopping the man dead in his tracks. Marco turned slowly, his face a glistening mask of pale sweat, attempting to summon the charm that had successfully manipulated an entire medical board 3 years ago, but failing miserably under the collective glare of New York's elite. "Mr. Thorne, surely you do not believe that hysterical display," Marco stammered, his hands trembling as he adjusted his silk tie. "These allegations are complex technical misunderstandings, and I assure you I will be suing for defamation." Dominic laughed, a dark, humorless sound that chilled the room as he closed the distance between them, towering over the shorter man with the menace of a storm front. "You are welcome to try, Marco," Dominic said, his voice dangerously soft, "but you might find it difficult to pay a retainer given that my legal team obtained an emergency court order 20 minutes ago, freezing all your personal and professional assets pending the federal investigation." Marco's eyes widened in genuine terror as the reality of his situation crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing building. "Federal investigation," he squeaked, his arrogance evaporating instantly. "Grand larceny, wire fraud, and perjury, just to name the headlines." Dominic listed the charges with cold satisfaction. "The district attorney has the server logs proving you stole the grant money, and the medical board has the original research notes you thought you deleted." Mia watched from the safety of Dominic's side, and for the first time in 3 years the monster who had haunted her nightmares shrank back into what he truly was, which was a pathetic small man motivated by greed and deep inadequacy. She felt the heavy chain of fear that had bound her chest for so long finally snap and dissolve into the ether. "It is over, Marco," she said, her voice steady and clear, ringing with the power of her reclaimed truth. "You can no longer hurt me." Marco looked at her pleadingly, searching for the naive woman he had once controlled, but found only a stranger made of steel. 2 uniformed security guards stepped forward to escort him away, not as a guest but as a detainee, awaiting the police sirens wailing in the distance. Dominic turned back to the room where the silent crowd stood watching in stunned reverence. He took Mia's hand, raising it for all to see. "I owe this woman a public apology," he announced to the room, "and so does every single person here who judged her by her station instead of her character." The silence inside the penthouse later that night was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of tension, but the peaceful stillness of a battlefield after the war has finally been won. Leo was fast asleep in his room, clutching his paper crane, his breathing deep, and even while Dominic Thorne stood by the panoramic window, watching the city lights that seemed to twinkle a little brighter than before. Mia stood near the fireplace, her hand resting on the marble mantel, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the gala, but feeling lighter than she had in 3 years. Dominic turned from the window, his silhouette framed by the skyline, and the look on his face was one of absolute clarity. "I have already instructed my lawyers to annul the engagement contract," he said, his voice low but final. "Camilla will not be returning to this home or to our lives ever again." Mia nodded, feeling a wave of relief crash over her, but before she could speak, Dominic crossed the room to stand before her, holding a thick velvet folder in his hands. "But that is not what I wanted to discuss with you," he continued, his gray eyes searching hers. "Tonight was about clearing your name, Mia, but tomorrow is about restoring your purpose." He opened the folder, revealing a set of architectural blueprints and a heavy brass key. "I purchased the brownstone building adjacent to Mount Sinai Hospital this morning," he explained. "It is fully funded and staffed, waiting for a director who understands that medicine is about connection, not just chemistry." Mia looked down at the plans, her breath catching in her throat as she read the name printed at the top of the document. The Moretti Center for Child Neurology. She looked up at him, tears blurring her vision. "Dominic, I cannot accept this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This is too much." "It is not a gift," Dominic corrected gently. "It is an investment in the future. There are thousands of children like Leo who are locked inside their own minds, waiting for someone with the patience to find the key. You are that key, Mia. You are the only one who can run this center, because you are the only one who knows what it feels like to be unheard." He placed the heavy brass key in her palm, closing her fingers over it. "I do not want a therapist for my son anymore," he said softly. "I want a partner who can change the world." Mia looked at the key then, at the man who had believed in her when she was nothing but a waitress with a stain on her apron. She thought of the long years of silence of the tables she had wiped and the dignity she had swallowed. She squeezed the key tight, feeling its cool metal bite into her skin, grounding her in this new reality. "I accept," she said, a tear finally escaping to track down her cheek. "I will make you proud, Dominic." "You already have," he replied, wiping the tear away. Mia stared at the heavy brass key lying in her open palm, feeling the cool metal bite into her skin, but a shadow of uncertainty clouded her eyes as the adrenaline of the evening began to fade into the quiet reality of the night. "Dominic, this center is everything I have ever dreamed of," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked up at him. "But if I am going to be the director of the Moretti Center, perhaps it is time for me to move out of the penthouse to maintain appropriate professional boundaries." The suggestion hung in the warm air between them like a brick wall being hastily rebuilt by fear, but Dominic Thorne moved to dismantle it instantly. He closed the small distance between them, invading her personal space, not with the intimidation of a CEO, but with the raw, magnetic vulnerability of a man who has finally found his equal. "Is that what you truly want, Mia?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion that vibrated deep in her chest. "To retreat back to cold professionalism after everything we have shared tonight?" He did not wait for her to answer. Instead, he reached out with a trembling hand and gently lifted the silver chain from her neck, his thumb brushing against the frantic pulse point at her throat. He held the silver ring with the caduceus symbol up to the flickering firelight, watching the twin snakes gleam in the amber glow. "When I first saw this ring swinging from your neck in the restaurant, I thought it was just a piece of jewelry, a trinket," he murmured, his storm-gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that scorched her soul. "But now I understand that it is a badge of honor. You carried this hidden under your uniform for 3 agonizing years as a silent promise to yourself that you were still a healer even when the world tried to tell you otherwise." He let the ring fall back against her chest, his hand lingering over her heart. "You healed my son, Mia, that is true, but you are the only person who has ever bothered to try and heal me." The confession stripped away the last fragments of his armor, revealing the lonely king beneath the billionaire facade, who had been starving for connection. "I do not want you to just run the clinic," Dominic whispered, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. "I want you to come home to me every single night, because this penthouse was just a museum of cold marble until you walked in and turned on the lights." Mia looked into his eyes, seeing the absolute truth reflected there, and the defensive walls she had built to protect her own shattered heart crumbled into dust. "I am scared, Dominic," she admitted, breathless. "I have lost everything before. Not this time," he promised fiercely. He captured her lips in a kiss that tasted of champagne and salvation, sealing their future not with a contract but with a vow. It was a kiss that erased the memory of the stained apron and the courtroom betrayal, replacing them with the promise of a partnership built on the unshakable foundation of shared courage. In the silence of the penthouse, with the city of New York sleeping below them, they stood locked together, not as employer and employee or savior and saved, but as 2 broken halves who had finally found their whole. 6 months had passed since the gala, transforming the biting cold of winter into the warm, golden haze of early summer in New York City. The morning sun streamed through the glass walls of the newly inaugurated Moretti Center for Child Neurology, illuminating the reception area where children played in a sensory-friendly environment designed with the specific rhythmic patterns that Mia Moretti had once tapped on a restaurant floor to save a screaming boy. Mia stood at the main nurse's station reviewing a complex patient chart, but today she was not wearing a stained black apron or uncomfortable service shoes. She was draped in a pristine white lab coat, her name embroidered in navy blue thread over her heart, and on her ring finger sat a vintage emerald engagement ring that caught the light with every confident movement. The heavy oak doors of the clinic swung open, but this time the sound did not bring a wave of anxiety or the demand to serve entitled patrons who refused to look her in the eye. Instead, it brought the 2 people who now anchored her entire world. Dominic Thorne walked in, no longer the stressed billionaire carrying the weight of an empire on rigid shoulders, but a man who looked 10 years younger, his gray eyes crinkling with a genuine smile reserved just for her. Beside him, skipping with a vibrant energy that would have been impossible half a year ago, was 7-year-old Leo. The boy did not shrink from the overhead lights or cover his ears against the hum of the clinic. He ran straight to Mia, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, a happy sound that replaced the traumatic memory of shattering glass. "Look, Mia, look," Leo shouted, his voice clear and confident as he held up a colorful drawing. "I drew the beat for you." Mia dropped the chart and knelt down, not in desperation this time, but in pure, unadulterated joy, meeting him at eye level. "It is beautiful, Leo," she whispered, pulling him into a fierce hug. "You captured the rhythm perfectly." Dominic joined them, placing a warm hand on Mia's shoulder and looking down at the pair with damp eyes. "I was watching you from the door," Dominic said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I was thinking about that night in the restaurant. The manager wanted to throw us out, Camilla wanted to discipline him, but you just knelt down and waited. Your patience left us in tears that night, Mia, and it is the only reason we are smiling today. Mia looked up at him and then around the clinic she had built. She saw the parents in the waiting room looking at her with hope instead of judgment, and she saw the staff looking at her with deep respect. The journey from the wet floor of Listel to the helm of this center had been paved with immense pain, but as she took Dominic's hand in her left and Leo's in her right, she knew she would walk it all again. "Are you ready to go home, Dr. Moretti?" Dominic asked, his voice full of the pride he had promised her. "I am ready," Mia replied, standing tall. Together, the three of them walked out into the bright city, no longer invisible, no longer broken, but a perfect symphony of three hearts beating in a rhythm of kindness that started it all. If this story of patience and redemption touched your heart today, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction is the heartbeat of this channel and helps us shine a light on more hidden heroes like Mia. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you are always the first to join us for the next emotional adventure. And please, share this video with anyone who feels invisible right now to remind them that true worth is never defined by the uniform you wear, but by the kindness you choose to show when the world is watching. Thank you for being part of our family.